You're listening to Systemic Era Podcast. The failure was designed.
America is a smoldering pile of rubble. This July 4 dot and this absurd law is to blame, based on an article by David Fajan. The kingdom was built in plain sight. The source is not confused about the direction of travel. It describes a country where a president accumulates power, courts bless the accumulation, Congress abdicates, billionaires adapt, and state force is used against ordinary people with little fear of consequence. That is the story. Everything else is decoration. Power is not missing. It is consolidating. The central fact here is not national decline in the abstract. It is power moving upward and inward, into the executive, into the courts, into oligarchic hands, and into agencies that now function as instruments of intimidation rather than public accountability. The source correctly identifies the shape of the problem: a presidency increasingly insulated from consequence, a Supreme Court willing to dignify abuse with legitimacy, and a Congress content to act like a bystander while the room burns. That is not dysfunction, it is consent by institution. When the people with formal authority refuse to use it, they are not neutral. They are helping decide who rules. Congress didn't fail, it yielded. The source says Congress has thrown in the towel. That is the polite version. What it actually describes is a legislative branch that has abandoned the role democracy assigned it. A legislature that cannot or will not check executive overreach is not merely weak, it is an accomplished executive dominance. This matters because Americans are still trained to mistake paralysis for helplessness. Congress is not helpless. It has simply found surrender more convenient than conflict. And once that bargain is normalized, every other abuse becomes easier to stage: war-making, corruption, anti-science governance, budget cruelty, and the slow laundering of lawlessness into procedure. ICE is not broken. It is doing the job it was built for. The source's brute squads are not an accident of staffing or training. They're the visible face of a coercive state that treats migrants, workers, and even citizens as disposable obstacles. People are being disappeared on the way to work, asked for papers, and in some cases killed in broad daylight with no meaningful consequence. That is not a few bad actors drifting off script. That is what happens when an enforcement machine is empowered to terrorize first and answer later. If the country is serious about democracy, ICE should be abolished, not patched up, not retrained, not cosmetically rebranded, abolished. An agency built to normalize racialized fear and bureaucratic disappearance cannot be made democratic by better talking points. The billionaire class chose the crown. The source is right to fixate on the rich, and not just because the numbers are grotesque. It matters that the same political order that strips social protections from millions has also produced a class of tech and business elites eager to kneel to power, swallow media institutions, and call it pragmatism. They are not being dragged along by events. They are underwriting the events, then buying insurance against the consequences. That is the real alignment here: wealth with impunity, power with vanity, and institutions with enough self-preservation to know which side of the boot to stand on. When the source points to lawsuits settled, companies capitulating, and media independence being eaten alive, it is describing a ruling class that has chosen access over principle and profit over democratic risk. The Electoral College is not an old quirk. It is democratic sabotage. The source is dead right to put the Electoral College on trial. That system is not a quaint relic. It is a structural device for allowing fewer people to govern more people. It gives outsized power to places that can rank low on education, healthcare, and opportunity while still determining the fate of the nation. This is the kind of machinery Americans are taught to describe reverently because it has a founding era pedigree. But pedigree is not legitimacy. A mechanism that routinely distorts popular rule is not an imperfection in democracy. It is a barrier to democracy. As long as it stays, minority rule keeps getting a head start. The pattern is authoritarian normalization. The source's real warning is bigger than one man, however dangerous he is. The pattern is institutional cowardice meeting concentrated wealth, then calling the result stability. A president can be described as abusive, corrupt, and legally toxic, and still be handed more power because the surrounding institutions have decided that resisting him is too costly. That is how democracies are hollowed out, not only by the strong man, but by everyone who makes the strong man easier to live with. So no, this is not both sides' country. One side is openly organizing around domination, obedience, and punishment. The other side, whatever its many flaws, remains the only viable institutional vehicle for resisting that project. The task is not to pretend the democratic coalition is perfect. It is to make it durable enough to stop accommodating its own defeat. You've been listening to Systemic Error. Thanks to Raw Story for today's article. With the automated voice of Kuzil, thanks for listening.